Amen. We've observed in Daniel chapter 2, in Daniel chapter 7, that when we see the fourth kingdom being presented to us, that it comes in two phases. Legs of iron, the feet of iron and clay, Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 7, the fourth beast that is strong as iron, and the little horn. And so when we come to Daniel chapter 8, based upon testimony of 2, we would expect to see this fourth kingdom also coming in two phases. But as you know, if you read verses 9 to 12, which deal with this fourth kingdom, that on the surface you don't see any indication that there are two phases of Rome being brought to view. We've discussed the Medes and Persians, the Grecian Empire, from verses 3 to 8. And then in verse 9, it talks about a little horn coming out from one of them. So let's turn to Daniel chapter 8 and read that verse. Daniel 8 verse 9, and out of one of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. We'll read from verse 10 right to 12. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice, by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So, on the surface, it doesn't appear that there's any kind of evidence to show two phases of Rome. So I'm only going to comment on it because I assume most people here already have a good understanding that the two phases of Rome that are brought to view in these 4 verses is based upon the verbs that are in these verses. And in the Hebrew, the verbs have gender built into those verb phrases. So when there's action being performed in the Hebrew, the way you identify what's going on is, or who's doing those activities, whether it's a masculine or a feminine person, is by the subtle changes in the verb itself. It's a marked difference to the way the English language is used, because in the English language, all verbs are gender neutral, and the way you identify gender is by adding pronouns to those verbs, or a noun, but mostly it's pronouns, a he or a she or a it. But in the Hebrew you don't need to do that, because the verbs themselves possess gender. There are subtle differences between the two. So is everybody aware of all of this? Yeah?
I never knew it was the verb.
It's not the verb, it's the noun.
No, it is the verb, because if you go to, for in,
Mare, mara, that's a noun, right?
if you go to verse, I see what you mean, but I'm talking about in these particular verses, because in verse 10 to 12, you never see the little horn ever being brought up after that.
10 to 12.
Yet if you look at the, we'll spend a couple of minutes looking at them if some people aren't too familiar with this. So in verse 9 it reads, and out of one of them came forth a little horn. Now a little horn, by its very nature, is a feminine object. You know, even in the English, we have some items, some objects which have masculine or feminine properties associated with them. For instance, an ocean liner or a boat is often referred, not often, I think it's always referred to as a feminine item. Yeah. So it's the same in the Hebrew, and because this little horn is a feminine object, everything that would be associated with this little horn should always be feminine. So all of these verses, from verses 9 to 12, they should all be in the feminine, because this little horn is doing all of these actions. But you can see when you read the King James, just in the King James, in verse 9 it just talks about the activities of the little horn. Then in verse 10 it doesn't mention the little horn anymore, but it mentions it via a pronoun, because in the original the little horn is never mentioned ever again in the preceding 3 verses. But in verse 10 it says it. So it makes it a gender-neutral object when it identifies that it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down the ground. It cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Then verse 11 it says, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. So you can see that there's been a change from the it to the he. And then when you drop down to verse 12, it reads, and a host was given him. You'll notice that the him in the King James there is italicized. So I assume everybody here knows that when there are thousands of words in the King James Bible that are italicized, indicating that they were supplied by the translators. When we talk about it being supplied, I assume we all know that there's not a one-to-one word mapping from Hebrew to English. It's not a one-to-one word mapping. So, for instance, when we would say, read, say in verse 11, when it would say the daily sacrifice. So, not dealing with the word sacrifice. When it says the daily, they're not 2 Hebrew words. It's only one word, the tamid, and it has a preface in front of that word, which indicates it should be a or the or them or us. So when we translate from one language to another, it's not one-to-one word mapping. So some people aren't aware of that, but you can see if you go to a Hebrew Old Testament, which has got Strong's numbers attached to them, you'll see that there are singular Hebrew words which, when they get translated into English, can turn out to be 3, 4, 5, 6 words, but none of them will be italicized. So the italicization of words is indicating that the translators are putting their own spin or their own thoughts into these words or into this passage. So in verse 12, when it says him, the him doesn't really belong there. And if we read the rest of the verse of verse 12, you'll see that when it's talking about the little horn, it mentions it in the it. Now, if you were to go back to the original, what you'd actually find is that it shouldn't be it. In verses 10 and 12, it's all of those verb actions are the feminine form of those actions. You can have a masculine form and a feminine form. So when the King James translators went ahead and tackled these 4 verses, they did half of it right, but then they, instead of translating, they began to interpret some of these verses, so they weren't true to their mission, if you like, because if they were, they would have gone, verse 10, it would have said, and she waxed great, verse 11, he magnified, and verse 12, it would have said, she cast down the truth to the ground. But in the feminine form, they make this subtle change and call it it. So we've all noticed this before, if you've done a study with respect to the daily in these 4 verses and the little horn. And so you know that even in the English, without knowing anything about Hebrew, that you can see the subtle differences between these verses as it transitions from a masculine to a feminine action that this little horn is doing. And at first sight, it's not obvious what's going on. In fact, if you were to talk, I know a sister who, when we were studying this a long time ago, she met an Adventist Hebrew scholar, I think someone from California, and if you've never met one, the first thing you'd want to ask him, can you read Hebrew? And he could. And she said, could you go into these verses and tell me, are these verses oscillating in the gender? And he read it. He said, yeah. And you think, wow, it's actually true. It's not something that some uneducated person's made up. It actually is really there. And then he said, so what? He's clueless to know why it is. And I think I mentioned this earlier. You can read the English, but it doesn't mean you understand what you're reading. And this is what this person did. So we can read all of these things. It doesn't mean we understand what's being taught or the import of those things. And that was the case with this theologian. He could see that it was masculine and feminine, but he didn't put any credence to that, because it's not the only place in the scriptures that this happens. You do get other places in the scriptures, individual odd verses, that you've got an object, a person or a thing that has gender attached to it, and its actions will be opposite to what its gender is. But there's something unique in these verses here. This oscillation is the only place in the scriptures that you see this going on, from the masculine to the feminine, masculine and feminine. And it's this clue that isn't obvious to see that identifies the two phases of Rome in these verses. That's the key that unlocks this. Today, you're probably all aware that most of the church, by a large margin, believes that the daily is the ministration of Christ. That's a given. We understand that. Sorry? That's what you were taught. Yeah. Most of us have been taught that way. In fact, when you taught something for so long one way, it's hard to actually see it the other way. And it's been so long that I've understood what the daily is. It's hard for me to actually go through the logic to explain how you could ever see it the other way round, because it's very difficult. So chapter 8 is following the same pattern as chapter 2, chapter 7, and now we're going to see still the two phases of Rome, but it's a lot harder to see. You have to dig a lot deeper to identify the two phases of Rome. And then when you get to Daniel 11, you're still going to see the two phases of Rome, but it gets even harder in Daniel 11. Daniel 2, you could see two different types of material. You see two different body parts. Daniel 7, you see the beast with this horn attached to it. Daniel 8, you see these two different genders. And in Daniel 11, it's so difficult, you don't see any difference between the two phases of Rome. Because in Daniel 11, they both go by the same title of the King of the North. And the only way you can decipher which phase of Rome is being dealt with in Daniel 11 is by the context of the verses that surround it. That's the only way you can do it. So if you don't know your history very well, or you don't interpret the verses correctly, you can make mistakes really quickly in Daniel 11 about how to identify which phase of Rome it's talking about. So it gets progressively harder as you go through the verses. So, to just address the issue that you brought up when you spoke about the Marah vision and the Mare vision, and one's masculine and one's feminine. Yes, there are nouns that are obviously feminine and masculine nouns, and we're not denying that fact, because in fact if you go to Daniel chapter 8 verse 9, it says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn. That horn is a feminine object, and it's a noun. We understand that it's feminine, and that's the whole point. You'd expect all the activities in these 4 verses all to be feminine, and because they're not, the identification of that should alert us to something. There's something going on here which is unusual, and it's that understanding that helps us to see which phase of Rome is being addressed here. The way the church normally tackles this is verses 9 and 10 are considered to be pagan Rome, and verses 11 to 12 are papal Rome. If you didn't have any tools, any clue to how to address these verses, it's a natural assumption to make that the first 2 verses are pagan and the last 2 are papal. In fact, when you read verse 10, you'll see that the structure of that verse and the activities that are going on can refer both to pagan and papal Rome. It's a pretty generic statement, because all it's basically saying is that the little horn is going to make war against God's people. That's essentially the long and short of Daniel chapter 8 verse 10. And both pagan Rome and papal Rome both do that activity equally well, and we know that.
Parminder, it would be helpful for me. Would you write on the board papal, pagan, which one's masculine, which one's feminine? Just put an M or an F by it.
Yes,
As you go along with
I'll go ahead and do that as we're progressing. So,
And there's another point. There's a question back here. So in verse 9, it's masculine. It's the little horn is masculine.
no, the little horn is feminine. A little horn, that horn is a feminine object. All I'm addressing is the horn itself is a feminine object, and you would expect the whole of these verses just to deal with feminine activities. But because when you just survey the 4 verses, you begin to realize there's a subtle difference that's going on, then you have to look at the verses in a bit more detail. And that's partly addressed your question, because you hadn't finished. Yeah.
Well, I want to stretch this a little bit. See, in Daniel 7, it's the little horn is feminine. In Daniel 8, the little horn is masculine. It starts out 8, 9, that out of the 4 winds. It's, so I...
Okay, so what I'm saying is this. A horn itself is a feminine object. So that's clear enough to understand. What's going to identify pagan Rome in verse 9? Out of all the verses, actually, verse 9 is the hardest one to tackle. It's the hardest one to address, even though we focus on verse 11 an awful lot.
Do you mean a horn in the Hebrew language is feminine?
Yeah.
Okay.
If let me just
You did say that verse 9 and 10 are both pagan Rome, and 11 and 12 are both papal.
No.
that's what the church teaches.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the church teaches that, because they don't have any other, or they refuse to see any other tools.
So that's incorrect.
Yeah. So what I'm suggesting is this. Verse 9, it reads, "Out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great." Now you can see a couple of things happening in this verse, a couple of activities that this little horn is doing. It says, "Out of one of them came forth," so there's a coming forth. A little horn. And then it says it does something. It waxed great. Waxed exceeding great, sorry. And then it gives you the directions that it does that from. It says the south, the east, and the pleasant land. And that pleasant land we would understand to be the glorious land. They're the same concept, the same principle. In the original, it just says the pleasant. It doesn't even have the word land in it, but it's talking about Israel or Palestine, the pleasant land. And then obviously it talks about the little horn. Without getting into the complexities of this, we will see that these activities that are being spoken of here have gender attached to them, and this coming forth is masculine, whilst this waxing great is feminine. Now, what you would expect to see is the coming forth should be a feminine action, because the little horn itself is feminine, so all of this should be feminine. But right in verse 9, you see that there's an anomaly brought to view, that this coming forth is different to what it should be. And this should alert you to some truth that God is trying to teach us about the activities of this little horn. And as you go to the other verses, it develops this principle, this concept. But it's right in verse 9, that we see this anomaly that you have a feminine object and its coming forth is being identified as a masculine activity. And it's this masculine activity here which is going to identify it to be pagan Rome. And the logic of making a masculine action attributed to pagan Rome is because pagan Rome is a nation state or a kingdom. And there are many, many stories to indicate that a kingdom is ruled by a king who is invariably a man. And we all understand that the papacy, however we want to describe it, is a church. It's a Christian church, and a Christian church is symbolized in Scripture by a woman. So that's the logic between the masculine and femininity. So in verse 9, you can see a feminine object is actually doing a masculine activity, indicating that there's some kind of anomaly between the two and that we need to investigate this closer. So it's this activity here that's coming forth in verse 9 that's indicating the activities of pagan Rome. And then it does some interesting things here about where it stretches forth to the south, the east, and the pleasant land. And I'll just quickly give the dates for these. Most of us are very familiar with this. This is in the year 63 BC. This is 64 BC. And this is 31 BC. And this is the most important date out of all of these three. This is the subjugation of Egypt in the time period of Cleopatra. Everybody's familiar with Cleopatra and who she was. And in 31 BC was the Battle of Actium. So we all understand that history reasonably well. Everybody knows about Cleopatra. You may or may not have heard of the Battle of Actium, which occurred in 31 BC. An interesting thought that sometimes we're not aware of is that because this is the south and we think that this is Egypt, and we think Cleopatra is an Egyptian queen, what we lose sight of sometimes is that this actually isn't Egypt of the pharaohs that as we understand it. You know, when you think of Pharaoh and Moses, the land is Egypt, but the nation is not Egyptian, because this nation here is actually Greece. So do we understand that? Yeah, that's not new to people, or it is? Kind of new? I did. Sorry. Okay, so we know that we have these four kingdoms: Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, pagan Rome. And we know that after the Medes and Persians and the Greeks take over, that, let me try and find it in my notes. When that happened, if we go back to the story of Greece, we know that we've already read that Alexander the Great is the great horn, and after him, when he rises up, he breaks, and for him, in his place, comes up four notable ones. These are the four generals. Yes, the four generals are Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus. These are the four generals. And after infighting one with another, two of these generals come off the scene, and you're left with two people who basically divide the kingdom between themselves. It's Ptolemy and Seleucus. And they're the king of the north and the king of the south that you see identified in Daniel chapter 11. So we know the king of the north and the king of the south. And the king of the south owns the territory of Egypt. So this history that's being brought to view here is the destruction, the final destruction of the Grecian Empire. The date that we normally use to transition from Greece to pagan Rome, does anybody know what we normally use? Or the battle or anything? The transition from Greece to pagan Rome, there's normally a date that the church, any kind of evangelistic campaigns, when they put the image there and they give dates. The date they normally use is 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna. And then we say, and what happened at Battle of Pydna? Everybody's got some understanding of the League of the Jews and the Romans. Yeah, it's on the charts, so you're familiar with that. 158, 161 BC. 168 is connected to all of that history. There's a connection between the history of 168 and the Battle of Pydna and the history of the League with the Romans and the Jews. And there's this transition now that's happening. Egypt is coming down and Rome is beginning to assert itself. But it hasn't completed its work. Here is the Battle of Pydna, which happens actually in the nation or the land area of Macedonia, which is Greece as we understand it today. So this is in Macedonia, but there's a lot more territory to take down before Greece is totally out of the scene and pagan Rome has come to the ascendancy. And that's what's being dealt with in Daniel chapter 8. It's the very remnant or the last piece of that destruction, because this east that gets taken down in 64 BC, this is Syria. This is the Syrian campaign that General Pompey undertakes. And when he subjugates Syria, he also subjugates Israel at the same time. And then around 30 years later, he's going to, not Pompey, but pagan Rome, is going to finally take Greece off the scene. So when we think about the destruction of Greece into pagan Rome, it takes a long time. It goes from 168 to 31 BC. It's not a straightforward process, as Daniel 2 would teach or Daniel 7. It's when you understand that verse 8 is talking about this transition from from Greece to pagan Rome, and it's all done by the year 31 BC. That's what verse 9 is teaching us. We're all familiar with the fact that 3 geographical areas or territories need to be taken down. Yeah. So this is the first time it happened, pagan Rome. Daniel 7 shows the same history for papal Rome, the same sequence of 3 nations having to be taken down before the papacy can rise to the throne. And we understand that the same thing is going to happen at the end of the world, Daniel 11 verses 40 to 45. Yeah, the king of the south, the glorious land, and Egypt. The reason why 168 is an important date is because 168 marks when pagan Rome becomes the king of the north. A careful study of Daniel 11 will show you that the transition from pagan Rome, from Greece to pagan Rome occurs in 168, and you'll notice that if these are the 3 geographical areas that need to be taken down before pagan Rome can rule supremely, you'll notice that it becomes king of the north before it does that. So before pagan Rome is going to take down its 3 territories, it's already taken the title of the king of the north. And what we'll identify is when the papacy is going to rise to the throne and it takes its 3 territories down, the Heruli, Vandals and Ostrogoths, it too will become the king of the north before that happens. So I don't know if you've ever thought about that before, because in Daniel 11 verse 40, the second part, it says what? Daniel 11 verse 40, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. So we understand that to be 1989, yeah, which is the first territory that's taken down, the first obstacle. The king of the north is taken down, but the papacy has already been identified by what title? King of the north. So the papacy has already taken the title, and it's in its third phase of the title of king of the north before it begins its work. So you'll see this in all three phases of Rome, that the king of the north, the title is taken down before those three geographical areas are addressed. The other thing that we'll notice is the sequence of what's happening here. We'll talk about that later on as we get through our study. So, verse 9 in summary. We have a feminine horn with a masculine activity indicating pagan Rome doing a work of rising to the ascendancy. And it takes down three territories. This is the subjugation of the Grecian Empire. It's complete by 31 BC. And it's taking down these three territories, and it's already got the title of the King of the North when it takes down the nation of Macedonia in 168 BC at the Battle of Pydna. Verse 10 we've already briefly discussed. There's not much to discuss on verse 10. And now it goes to this gender neutral, but in the original it's in the feminine. So we should actually read this, she, and she waxed great, even to the host of heaven. The host of heaven are God's people here on earth. And she cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground, and she stamped upon them. Now, because this is in the feminine form, verse 10 is feminine. So we'll write here, verse 9 is pagan, masculine. Verse 10 is papal, feminine. Verse 11, verse 12. We know verse 11, we already read it. It says he, hence being pagan, masculine. And verse 11 says it, the same as verse 10, which is papal, feminine. Verse 12, verse 12. Verse 11. Verse 11 is the most problematic or complex verse to deal with. Verse 9 takes some struggling with because of this issue about the feminine noun with the masculine activity. But verse 10 has got a lot of verse 11 has got a lot of information there, and it takes a bit of picking out to figure out what's going on. Verse 11. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So there are a number of things that are occurring in verse 11. It covers a number of different histories. And the first thing we want to understand, it talks about he in the masculine, yea, he. It's talking about the pronoun or the subject, and the subject being a little horn. When you trace it back right down to verse 9. So you know this is talking about the little horn. It's in a masculine form, so we know that this is talking about pagan Rome, not the papacy. So verse 11 begins with this concept that, first of all, we know we're talking about pagan Rome. Yea, pagan Rome magnified himself even to the prince of the host. We will understand who the prince of the host is. We know that this is Jesus. If you want to look at some verses to identify this, you could go to Joshua chapter 5, verse 14. We won't go there. You can just write a reference for it if you like in your Bible or in your notes. Joshua 5:14, and also Daniel 11, verse 22. Both of those speak either about the prince of the host or the prince of the covenant. So this is Jesus. And verse 11 is talking about the same history that's covered in Revelation chapter 12. You're familiar in Revelation chapter 12 that this great red dragon comes to earth and tries to kill the child that's born from this woman who's brought to view in the first few verses. So we won't turn there if everybody's familiar with those verses. We're all familiar with them? Yeah, that concept. So we know that this is Jesus, and he magnifies himself, pagan Rome, both at Christ's birth, when they try to kill him, and eventually at his death, when he's 33 and a half years old, they eventually succeed and magnify themselves and crucify Jesus. Then we get to the next part of the verse. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So we want to spend some time looking at this, because we want to identify what this daily is. Now, I don't know if you about yourself, but I've been in many different discussions with people about how to grapple with verse 11 to work out what the daily is. And I've dialogued with people who are conservative Adventists who used to believe that the daily was paganism and have been won over. They've been won over to the new view of the daily by the work of various conservative authors. So it's not a minor issue about what the daily is. Just want to point out something. Everybody knows the history and the warfare about the 2520. I don't mean today, I mean historically. So we know that in the year 1863, and we know that that has a prophetic significance from the chiastic structure of the 2520. Most people here know that study? Yes, no? Not getting many. Okay, so some of us don't. But in 1863, sorry? Oh, in 1863, there's a rejection of the 2520. Everybody here is familiar with that. And around the year 1901 and ongoing, there's rejection of the daily. And then around from the 1930s to the 50s, there's rejection of the understanding of Islam and the trumpet. So the three things that are on these charts that today that we war against, I know we concentrate or focus an awful lot on the 2520, but there are three elements that are rejected today by the church. The 2520, the daily, and Islam. And when we talk about the four generations in the book of Joel that you've probably heard a controversy over, you can identify that controversy is going on in these various generations of Adventism. And what you can see that in the first, second, and third generations of Adventism, that there's been a progressive attack on these fundamental truths, these foundational truths that are on this chart. So the issue of the daily is not something that's insignificant. We had some dialogue back where I live about if the usefulness of the 1863 chart and the information that's contained in it. And some people think that it's not that harmful, it's pretty benign, the 1863 chart, because there's a lot of truth on the 1863 chart. In fact, you're probably aware that the 1863 chart has a little booklet that goes along with it, like a study pack, because it doesn't have all the writing on there. And when you go through the study pack, they actually mention the dates, 677 to 1844. Now, they don't quite phrase it that way, but they'll identify a historical event here and a historic event here. And some people who actually promote the 1863 chart and rejected 2520 aren't even aware that in the study notes it actually tackles these two dates. And we had some discussion a while back. People were saying that if you were asked to present some truth, but you only could use the 1860 chart, would you go ahead and do that? Because you can develop a pretty strong argument about the 2520 being correct just by the information that's in this study pack. And some people are saying, yeah, if you've got the opportunity, you should do that. But my response was, no, you shouldn't. Because even though that there are many truths on the 1863 chart, the 1863 chart was just the beginning of the erosion of the foundational truth of Adventism. It was what was going on in the first generation of Adventism, and it's by the time you get to the third that you get this final collapse of all the foundational truths that we need to understand at the end of the world. And it's these three things that the church is warring against. And it's not accidental. I'm not saying today it's premeditated in some kind of sinister way, but the church has been educated and indoctrinated to have got rid of all of these truths, and that's what the warfare is about. So the issue of the daily is of extreme importance to us, whether we understand daily to be correct, that it's paganism, whether it's Christ's ministration in the courts of heaven, just as we focus on the 2520. So, the second part of the verse says, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar that Ellen White talks about this daily in her writings when she says that it's a construction of the construction of that phrase, the daily sacrifice, is a construct that's been made by man. Mentioned yesterday, Ellen White uses a number of different Bible versions when she's going to quote scripture in her works, and she never ever makes any kind of issue about whether or not we should be using the King James or whether we shouldn't, and she never talks about any kind of supplied words, except in one place, and it's when it comes to the book of Daniel. This is where she has problems when she addresses this issue. So I don't have the Ellen White reference at the moment. I'll look for it in a moment, if someone wants to find it and let me know. I did have it in my notes, but I can't see where it is. Oh, right, yes. You should know that. And there's another place that it's found as well, and I'm trying to think what the other place is. It's found in three places: Experience and Views, which is a book that's contained in early writings, but there's another one that escapes my attention. The reason why it's interesting to note that, because in the early writings passage where she talks about the word sacrifice was supplied by man, she does it in the midst of a paragraph, and there's a lot more words that are attached to that in the early writings passage. But when you see how it's laid out in some of the other some other of her works, and I can't remember the name of the other one. Can you find the other one?
Is it the exact same phrasing?
Yeah, Experience and Views is exactly how it's written in early writings, but there's a third one.
It's different phrasing a little bit?
It's not so, the phrasing's the same, but the way the actual pagination is laid out is different. That's it. 50. Yeah. So let me write that down. Review and Herald, 1850. And what's the month? Yeah, November the 1st. When you see how it's laid out in the Review and Herald article, you'll see what she's doing is she's not getting these different thoughts and putting them into a single paragraph. It's almost like bullet points. She's bullet pointing various independent thoughts and ideas. Because one of the things that people bring up is when you look in early writings and you address this issue about the daily, it's connected with time setting. Yeah? And this is one of the arguments people use, that there's some kind of connection about the daily and time setting, and we don't really understand what she was talking about when she speaks about the daily sacrifice, because they want to connect it with the issue of time. But in the original, which is the Review and Herald, it's the earliest published information for this statement here, because I think Experience and Views is 1851, and this is, I think, 1886, early writings. You'll see that it's actually bullet pointed, and the daily sacrifice here is on its own, and then the issue of time is on its own, and they're totally independent thoughts. I don't know if you probably do know that most of Ellen White's books, the published books that we have that are distributed around, to the general public, and they were designed for that, were heavily edited to make sure all the grammar and the language and the structure was all correct. When you see Ellen White's original words, which were never edited, it's just her writings, sometimes the layout and the wording and the structure, it doesn't look the same, it doesn't flow as well. And especially when she has visions, often they're not laid out in smooth, long sentences like you and I would have in a conversation. They're a bit staccato and they're just like bullet points. And often they're independent thoughts that are just put together in a vision, and you're left to work out what they mean and what they don't mean. And this is one of those examples of that. So when we look at this, we don't get caught up trying to associate the daily sacrifice with time being no longer an issue. They're totally independent thoughts. I just wanted to bring that point up. So this is the only place that you're going to find in her writings where she says that supplied words shouldn't be there. So that's why often when you see people up front reading, they won't read the word sacrifice as they're reading through these verses. And what is Ellen White trying to say when she says that? When William Miller was looking at this passage and he was trying to understand what Daniel 8 was talking about, he came across the same issue that Ellen White is addressing here. Sorry, early writings is 1882, not 1886. I'll read the passage out. Then I saw in relation to the daily, Daniel 8:12, that the word sacrifice was supplied by man's wisdom and does not belong to the text, and that the Lord gave the correct view of it to those who gave the judgment hour cry when union existed before 1844. Nearly all were united on the correct view of the daily. But in the confusion since 1844, other views have been embraced and darkness, confusion have followed. Time has not been a test since 1844, and it will never again be a test. When you read it in early writing 74, it just flows in the same paragraph, and people have picked up on this, suggesting that it's connected thoughts, and my contention is that it isn't, because when you see it in the Review and Herald article, it's actually laid out differently, and there's separate independent points. Let's just give you a reference of what, we're just going to read what William Miller says on this issue. 1843, Apollos Hale, the Second Advent Movement. It's the name of a magazine, and that's the reference for it. This is what a biography of his work says. On another occasion, he stated his mode of settling the meaning of the text before us, the meaning of the daily. I read on, he said, and could find no other case in which it was found but in Daniel. So we just want to stop there for a second. Now, this word daily, I'm sure most of us understand that there's various ways of spelling it. So if I spell it different to you, you go ahead and spell it how you feel best. But this word tamid occurs 104 times in the Bible. But when William Miller makes a comment on that, he says, I could find no other case in which it was found. So he says when he looked at the word daily, he couldn't find anywhere in the Bible where this word came up. And most people use this statement as, to ridicule the work of William Miller, because they said, any reasonable Bible student could have seen that it occurs many, many other times in the Bible. Or they say that he used the wrong type of concordance. You're familiar that he uses Cruden's Concordance. Most Adventists realise that. But some people don't realise that he hasn't got any Greek or Hebrew in there. All it is just an English word study. So it'll take any word and it will just tell you all the Bible verses of it. It won't tell you what the meaning of that verse is. So it's not a very sophisticated concordance. And he did that deliberately. It wasn't. He could have used Strong's. Strong's was available, but he deliberately didn't want to, because he just wanted to wrestle with the Bible as it read. He didn't want to have other men's thoughts and ideas of what they thought was going on. So he says that he can't find this word anywhere else in the Bible. Then I took those words which stood in connection with it, the take away. He shall take away the daily, that's one phrase, from the time the daily shall be taken away, etc. And I read on, and thought I should find no light on the text. Finally, I came to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, and only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then shall that wicked be revealed. And when I had come to that text, oh, how clear and glorious the truth appeared. There it is, that is the daily. Well now, what does Paul mean by he who now letteth or hindereth? By the man of sin and the wicked, popery is meant. Well, what is it which hinders popery from being revealed? Why, it is paganism. Well, then the daily must mean paganism. This led Mr. Miller to believe that the daily of Daniel 11 was paganism or idolatry. Now, when William Miller is phrasing this passage, he's going to refer to Daniel chapter 8, verse 11, 11 verse 31, and 12 verse 11. These are the three Bible verses that he refers to in this statement that we just read, because he puts in quotation marks these various Bible phrases. To summarize what William Miller is saying, he says this. He finds the phrase daily sacrifice. He looks at it and he says, I can't find this used anywhere else in the Bible. So he doesn't understand how he's going to find out what the daily means. Then he says he takes the words that are in connection with this, which is the phrase take away. It leads him to 2 Thessalonians. And in his study of 2 Thessalonians, he sees this. He sees that there's a power here who is hindering this other power from coming to the ascendancy. So the first power is hindering the second power. And he clearly understands and can identify that the second power is the papacy. And then he used simple logic. So it says in 2 Thessalonians, this power is hindering this power until the first power is taken away. That's essentially what we just read from 2 Thessalonians. This power hinders or stops this power until the original one is taken away. And he says, well, we know what the papacy was. It rose up in 538, received deadly wound in 1798. And he says, what was hindering the papacy from rising? It must have been the power that came before. And he understands this to be pagan Rome correctly. So there he put here pagan Rome. So he could see that pagan Rome was taken out of the way, or as he would express it, paganism. So this was the logic that he used to understand what the daily was. It's from the phrase take away, and it's used here in 2 Thessalonians, the taking away, and he identified it to be pagan Rome or paganism. Ellen White is going to tackle the same issue, and she's going to say the reason for this is that the word sacrifice shouldn't be there. And then she's going to talk about this passage from that perspective. Now, both Ellen White and William Miller have obviously, Ellen White had divine insight, and William Miller too had divine insight, but they don't explain explicitly what's going on, what the issue is. So there's a bit of grammar that needs to be addressed in this phrase here. Now, if you take this phrase, daily sacrifice, this word here, sacrifice, is a noun. Which would make the daily an adjective. But if you take the word sacrifice away, the word daily then becomes a noun. And in their subtle ways, both William Miller and Ellen White are directing us to this truth that the word daily here is a noun and not an adjective. William Miller says this. He says, I looked at the word daily and I can't find it anywhere else, indicating it's a noun. And Ellen White says, take the word sacrifice out, and again, making it a noun. If you take tamid, which is daily, there are a number of other Bible words, English words, that are used to express tamid. But the phrase daily sacrifice is only used in the book of Daniel. It's not used anywhere else. So the word daily could be used in other Bible verses, but the phrase daily sacrifice is only used here in the book of Daniel, the few times that it's used here. So there's 104 usages of this word tamid, but it's only 5 times in the book of Daniel. And the 5 times that it's used in the book of Daniel, the word sacrifice is supplied 5 times, and it shouldn't be there. So William Miller had a deep insight that I think only God could have given him to recognize that in the book of Daniel there's a unique difference of what the daily is compared to all the other Bible verses that you can find the other 99 times that it occurs in the Bible. And that this word daily is not an adjective, but it's a noun. In all the other 99 usages of the Bible, everywhere you find this word daily, it's either an adverb or an adjective. Everybody knows what an adjective and an adverb is, yeah? I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I go to lots of places and lots of people don't know. It's not something to be embarrassed or ashamed. Lots of people aren't sure what an adjective or an adverb is. The simplest way you can explain them is that they're modifying words. You get either a noun or you get an action, and you're going to change it, you're going to modify it, like a big ball, or you ran fast. It describes or modifies how an action is occurring or how an object is being described. But in Daniel, in all the 5 usages of this word, it's not an adjective or an adverb, it's actually a noun. So that's the first thing that that we need to get to grips with when we talk about verse 11. First of all, that it's pagan Rome. So here's pagan Rome. And secondly, that the word daily is a noun. It's not an action that somebody is doing. It's an object, a thing in and of itself. The reason why those 2 thoughts are important is because the way the church teaches verse 11, it says that the daily sacrifice is the daily ministration of Christ. We're all familiar with that. It's the work of Christ in the most holy place, or in the holy place, depending on the time frame that you're looking at. So the first part that we want to see is that because this is dealing with the history of pagan Rome, we know that Christ, when pagan Rome is in existence, the papacy has not entered the scene yet. So we can understand that this is talking about pagan Rome, not the papacy. So this can't be the papacy taking over the ministry of Christ. Pagan Rome never did that. Pagan Rome persecuted Christ, but they never tried to take over his ministry. So we know it can't be the work of Christ's ministry there. And the other thing we know, it's not something that Christ does, it's actually an object in and of itself. But there are other clues to this issue as well. If we look at the verse, it says, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. So we'll just read we'll read the passage from the beginning. He magnified himself even to Jesus, and by him the daily was taken away. So it says by him the daily is taken away. The first thing that we want to see, I'll write it over here, is that the word by has been incorrectly translated. It shouldn't be by. If you have a marginal reading in your Bible, it will tell you that the word should be from. If you look at the Hebrew word that's being directed here, the word by is incorrect. It should be from. This is one of the strongest arguments the church thinks to use to indicate that this is actually talking about the ministration of Christ, because it says, from him the daily sacrifice was taken away. And this him is being identified by the church as Christ. So we've tackled the issue. It's not by, but it should be from. We've also looked at the issue of sacrifice. So the word sacrifice should not be there. Then we want to look at grammar. In this, if we call it a sentence, it says that Rome magnified himself against Jesus. And from him the daily sacrifice was taken away. So if you were to read this sentence, you've got two ways of addressing who the him is. Obviously it can either be Rome or it can be Jesus. It can be one of these two. And how would you know, if you were going to look at a sentence, which one it would be? How would you know if it would be Jesus or if it would be Rome? Most of the time when you look at a sentence, you can figure it out because of the way the sentence is constructed. But there are actually grammatical rules to actually work out how you should tackle a complex sentence like this. So, do we all know that this is the subject and that this is the object? They're both nouns. The subject of the sentence is this, and it's going to be doing something to the object. So there's a subject and object association in this verse. When you look at grammar, there are various rules of grammar to be able to decipher sentences like this. Let me rub some of this board out. You've got two rules to work out which one it is. This is the pronoun. And these are both nouns. One of the rules that you use is called grammatical nearness. This is the rule that the church uses. The church uses this rule, and what it says basically is grammatical nearness. So what you're going to see is when you look at a pronoun, you see which noun is the pronoun connected to. What's the nearest noun that's connected to the pronoun? and there's the pronoun, and the nearest noun is Jesus. So this is the rule that the church uses to decipher that the hymn is talking about Jesus. But there's another rule, and this is subject association. Subject association says that the pronoun is connected to the subject of the sentence, not the object, not the closest noun. So the question is, which one would you use? So if I wrote that this was the church, and I wrote that this was us, you'd kind of think, well, we're not sure which one it is. But if you go into the original, when you go back into the original Hebrew, if you see the way sentences are constructed in the original, they're not constructed in the same way as the English. They're actually, the sequencing of the words is often totally different to what you see written in the English. So if we were to go back to the original, and I know most people, I don't know if you've got computers here, but most of you have got a computer and you do your studies. I presume most of you use Strong's Concordance, not Strong's, eSword. Yeah, most people use eSword. If you download a Bible from eSword, and the coding for that is HOT+, which stands for the Hebrew Old Testament, and the plus indicates Strong's. Even if you can't read Hebrew, you don't need to. You can work out what the Hebrew words are by the Strong's numbers that are attached to them. And it shows you that it will show you in the original how these verses were constructed. And in this particular verse, it's not constructed in the same way that it is in the English. There are these subtle differences between them.
So could you repeat that? What's the HOT+?
Yeah. Hebrew, Old Testament.
Where did you put that? I'm sorry.
Okay, so if you go to eSword and you go to, I think it's called Download in the top part of the, yeah, it's called Download. You go to Download, go to Bibles. If you run down, and I think it says something like Other Languages, you'll find HOT+. So in the original, the sentence is structured in a slightly different way, and it structures something like this. Even to the prince of the host, he magnifies himself. And from him, the daily sacrifice is taken away. So I'm just dealing with the first part of the verse, not the whole of the verse. So you can see that in the original, even to the prince of the host is actually being placed before this part where it says he magnified himself. It doesn't change who the subject or the object is. This is still the subject and this is still the object and this is still the pronoun. But when you see this subtle change in the original, and they're going to use the same kind of grammar rules that we do, you can see two things. First of all, that the pronoun here is now associated to the nearest noun, which is Rome, the little horn. And also, so it meets this rule, and it's also going to be associated to the subject. So both of these grammatical rules that are in common usage with everybody, if you're an expert at grammar and I'm not, we know that these rules work. This sentence follows both of these rules and it always comes to the same answer, that the hymn is talking about the he, or pagan Rome. And when you put the word from, not by, it reads this way: even to the prince of the host, pagan Rome magnified himself, and from pagan Rome, the daily is taken away. So there's these 3 rules that are clearly showing you that the daily cannot be the ministration of Christ. It cannot be the ministration of Christ. But there are still some more rules. There's so much information that's in Daniel 8 verse 11 to show you that this view of the daily, and often we call that Daniel's view of the daily, or Conrad's view of the daily, that it's so erroneous. There's so much information. It's a wonder that people still give it any credence today. You know, even if you only had 1 rule to show that, it would be fine. But I'm going to show you 5 rules. We've shown you by and from the word sacrifice. We've looked at the grammar. And the next thing we're going to quickly look at is the phrase take away. So, again, most of us here who understand or have looked at this in the past, I'm just going to rub this out. When we look at this phrase take away, we understand that when you look at the various verses in the book of Daniel, the 5 places where the daily is mentioned, that this phrase take away, there are 2 separate words that are used to describe this word take away. One of them is the Hebrew word rum, and the other one is sir. So the people who are not familiar with that, everybody familiar with this with these 2 words? There are 2 Hebrew words, rum and sir, which are translated as being take away, but they mean different things. So if we were to think that, say there's a table, and there's a dollar bill on this table and a used tissue, and I said, could you take those 2 things away? Yeah, the action would be the same, you're taking them away. And if there was a dustbin here, what would you do with the used tissue? You throw the used tissue away here, but the dollar bill, if you took that away, you wouldn't throw it away, would you? Because it has intrinsic value to you. Yeah? You'd, in essence, exalt it. So when it's taken away, it would be lifted up and it would be exalted because it's precious and you would keep it. So these 2 words have these subtle differences. This would be rum and this would be sir. So you would rum something that has value and you would sir something that doesn't have any value. But both words are correctly translated as take away. And in Daniel chapter 8 verse 11, this word rum is used. So in verse 11 it says rum, and rum means to lift up and exalt. It means take away, but it means to lift up and exalt. The first part of verse 11, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. This is BC 4 BC, and 31 AD. This is in the life of Christ. This is what's been identified there. The second part of the verse, and from pagan Rome, the daily is taken away. So from pagan Rome, the daily is taken away, lifted up, and exalted. Have I run out of time? I've lost track of time. Hour and 10 minutes or a bit more?
Yeah,
hour and 20. Okay, we'll make a break here and we'll carry on with our studies after the break. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy towards us as we desire to honour you in our thoughts, our feelings, in all that we do and say. We ask that you would be with us, bless us and guide us. Help us to continue to honour you. We ask in the name of Jesus.